Russia's war machine, crumbling under pressure. Russia's military campaign, which has now stretched over nearly 3 years, is visibly faltering. The invasion, intended as a show of strength, has instead exposed critical weaknesses in the Russian army. President Vladimir Putin's attempts to procure tens of thousands of troops from North Korea to bolster efforts in the KSK Oblast have failed to prevent a cascading collapse of the Russian military. Contributing factors to Russia's decline. Several factors have accelerated the decline of Russia's armed forces. Harsh winter conditions. The severe winter has compounded the difficulties faced by Russian troops, straining their morale and physical endurance. Ukraine's utilization of Western military aid. Superior Western-supplied weaponry has given Ukrainian forces a significant edge on the battlefield. Logistical failures. The Kremlin's inability to provide adequate supplies, humanitarian necessities, and modern equipment has left both Russian and North Korean troops vulnerable. Reports from soldiers on the front lines paint a dire picture. Many claim they are unable to secure basic needs such as food, water, and proper sleeping arrangements. Equipment shortages are equally problematic. Soldiers lament that much of their weaponry and vehicles date back to the Soviet era, rendering them ineffective against Ukraine's modern Western-supplied arsenal. Mounting casualties and equipment losses. Recent data underscores the extent of Russia's military woes. Casualties. According to Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has suffered a staggering 754,590 casualties since the invasion began on February 24, 2022. This figure includes soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. In November alone, 4,720 Russian soldiers were rendered unable to fight. Equipment losses. November saw record losses for Russia, with 307 tanks, 899 armored combat vehicles, and 884 artillery pieces destroyed. The estimated financial toll of these losses exceeds $3 billion, surpassing those recorded in September and October. These losses have alarmed even Putin, leading to renewed nuclear threats. However, such posturing has only bolstered Western resolve to support Ukraine, further escalating Russian casualties. Western support, a decisive factor. The United Kingdom, second only to the United States in military aid to Ukraine, has pledged $12.8 billion in support, including $7.8 billion specifically for military aid. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has promised hundreds of air defense missiles and attack aircraft, further strengthening Ukraine's position. This sustained support has allowed Ukraine to halt Russia's advances and even reclaim significant territory. UK Defense Minister Tony Rockin highlighted the extent of Russia's losses, stating that the invasion of Ukraine represents a catastrophic failure for Moscow. According to Rockin, Russia has lost nearly half its combat capability in Ukraine, including 2,500 tanks, while its annual production capacity stands at just 200 tanks. Ukraine's losses, a grim reality. While Ukraine has achieved remarkable successes, the toll of war on its forces is undeniable. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has confirmed that over 43,000 soldiers have been killed since the full-scale invasion began, with another 370,000 wounded. Despite these losses, approximately 50% of the injured have returned to service, demonstrating Ukraine's resilience. The Russian home front, growing discontent. Back in Russia, public sentiment toward the war has soured significantly. Economic instability, marked by inflation nearing 10% and interest rates at 21%, has fueled widespread dissatisfaction. In regions like Bussia, the Urals, and Krasnodar, once prevalent pro-war propaganda has all but disappeared. Residents have removed the letter Z stickers from their cars, and patriotic events now draw sparse crowds. A recent survey by the Laboratory of Public Sociology revealed that many Russians are disengaged from the war, pretending it isn't happening. The high salaries promised to conscripts have failed to quell discontent, particularly among those who feel alienated from the conflict or burdened by its economic and social fallout. Economic strain and Putin's diminished authority. The economic toll of the war has been staggering. Since February 2022, Russia has reportedly spent $200 billion on its military operations in Ukraine. This enormous expenditure has destabilized the Russian economy, yet Putin remains steadfast in his aggressive policies. On the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Putin attempted to frame the invasion as a historical milestone akin to the 1917 communist takeover. However, this rhetoric rings hollow for ordinary Russians, who are grappling with the realities of inflation, economic decline, and a seemingly unwinnable war. The outlook for Russia. As the war drags on, Russia's future appears increasingly bleak. Mounting casualties, dwindling resources, and growing domestic discontent have left Putin's regime in a precarious position. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to consolidate its gains, bolstered by unwavering Western support. For Russia, the war in Ukraine is no longer just a military conflict. It is a stark reflection of its diminishing power on the global stage. According to a recent poll, nearly half of Russians now support the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine, even if it means abandoning President Vladimir Putin's stated objectives for the invasion. This sentiment is notably higher among women and younger generations. Historically, patriotism has run deep among the Russian populace, particularly during key moments like the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which initially spurred a wave of nationalistic fervor. However, attitudes have shifted significantly in the years since. Following the economic downturn and stagnation that began after the Crimea crisis and the resulting sanctions imposed by Western nations, many Russians started prioritizing prosperity over nationalistic aspirations. By 2021, surveys indicated that 60% of Russians favored a higher standard of living over being perceived as a global power, with only 30% prioritizing the latter. Furthermore, nearly half of Russians expressed interest in forging closer economic ties with the West, a figure that far outpaced those advocating for stronger ties with alternative blocs. This trend persisted even after the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as only 25% of respondents expressed a desire for further territorial annexation. Interestingly, even among Russia's most ardent militaristic supporters, dissatisfaction with the ongoing war is growing. Prominent pro-war bloggers, such as Maxim Kalashnikov, have openly criticized the military's logistical and strategic shortcomings. In one instance, Kalashnikov shared a soldier's report about the dire conditions at a medical outpost near the front lines, highlighting the inadequacies of the Russian military's operations. These reports reflect broader systemic issues plaguing Russia's war efforts, from insufficient medical supplies to morale-straining conditions among troops. Economic realities straining war efforts. Russia's economy, initially bolstered by wartime spending and increased wages resulting from manpower shortages, is beginning to falter. The Russian central bank projects GDP growth of only 0.5% to 1.5% for the coming year, a sharp decline from this year's 3% and last year's 3.5%. This downturn is compounded by rising costs of living. An independent study tracking consumer spending in 240 towns revealed that the average bill for everyday goods and services has increased by over 22% in just 1 year. The ruble has also suffered significantly, with its exchange rate against the dollar plummeting to historic lows, falling below 100 rubles to the dollar for the first time since the invasion began. These challenges are further exacerbated by new U.S. sanctions targeting Russian banks, making it increasingly difficult for these institutions to secure foreign currency reserves. State-owned enterprises, particularly in the defense sector, have absorbed vast amounts of capital, leaving the private sector starved of investment opportunities. The combination of high borrowing costs and limited investor confidence has led to a near-complete collapse of private industry. Compounding these issues, there appears to be no clear vision for Russia's long-term economic future, with many citizens feeling a sense of despair and anticipating worsening conditions. Oleg Vyugin, a former deputy governor of Russia's central bank, has shed light on the Kremlin's increasingly precarious financial position. To sustain wartime expenditures without cutting other public spending, the government abandoned a fiscal rule that required saving oil revenues exceeding $45 per barrel in a rainy day fund. Instead, the Kremlin has drained this fund at an alarming rate. As reserves dwindle, the government has resorted to raising corporate and personal income taxes starting next year, alongside imposing hefty fines to boost revenue, though such measures are unlikely to stabilize the economy in the long term. The lifeline of oil revenue. Despite these struggles, Russia has managed to sustain its occupation of Ukrainian territory largely through oil revenues. However, the global oil market presents significant challenges for the Kremlin. Weak demand, particularly from China's sluggish economy, combined with ample supply, has driven down international oil prices. Brent crude futures have declined by 4% since the beginning of the year, while U.S. West Texas Intermediate futures dropped by 1% over the same period. Adding to Russia's woes, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has announced plans for further restrictions on Russian energy exports, a critical source of funding for the war effort. Although details of these new sanctions remain undisclosed, their intent is clear: to tighten the economic stranglehold on Russia and force an end to its aggression. In response, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov denounced the U.S.'s actions, arguing that such measures undermine Russia's economic sovereignty. However, these protests do little to mitigate the growing economic strain. Sanctions on Gazprom Bank, a major financial institution managing international energy transactions, have further limited Russia's access to global markets. Additionally, the G7's price caps on Russian oil, coupled with restrictions on insurance, brokerage, and shipping services, have significantly curtailed the Kremlin's oil revenues. In November alone, Russia's oil revenue dropped by 21% compared to the previous year. Even with alternative buyers like India and China, the cumulative effect of these sanctions is undeniable. The end of the road for Putin's war? As the economic and military costs of the war continue to mount, Putin faces a precarious balancing act. On one hand, cutting military expenditures could trigger a domestic recession and risk alienating his base of support. On the other, maintaining lavish wartime spending risks spiraling inflation and deeper economic instability. Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of Russia's central bank, claimed in parliament that the economy is operating at full capacity, with a record-low unemployment rate of 2.4%. However, this figure masks the reality that much of Russia's workforce has been funneled into the defense sector, leaving the private economy in tatters. Despite these challenges, Russia's military losses continue to climb. Casualty rates have reached staggering levels, with thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured each month. Meanwhile, Western military support for Ukraine has only strengthened, allowing Kyiv to mount successful counteroffensives and reclaim occupied territories. The Kremlin's reliance on dwindling oil revenues and its inability to address the socio-political dissatisfaction brewing within its borders suggest that Putin's position is becoming increasingly untenable. As international sanctions tighten and domestic discontent grows, the sustainability of Russia's war effort and Putin's regime itself appears ever more uncertain. For now, the end of the road may be closer than the Kremlin is willing to admit.